Hello, welcome to On My Nerves, the podcast all about science and pop culture. So this is the first time I've attempted to record anything in a few months. It is now December, and although this probably will not be coming out until like mid-January, late January, at the time of recording, it is currently the last couple days of 2025. I can't lie, the end of 2025 has been one of the weirdest last 4 months of the year I have possibly ever experienced. The last episode I recorded, I had just gotten back from a trip to the West Coast, and I was focusing, at least at my job, a lot of my energy on presentations and conferences that I had upcoming that were supposed to be in October and November. And unfortunately, everything kind of came to a screeching halt in a somewhat unexpected way. And when I say unexpected, I really mean it was expected and avoidable, and sadly, completely out of my control. And therefore, recently, I have seriously been trying to remind myself that I should not be stressing about the things that are out of my control, because I had worked very hard on the stuff I was doing for these conferences and they just kind of went poof all of a sudden overnight. And that's kind of a difficult thing to reconcile with a little bit, especially when you've been planning for so long to do them. Recently, I've really had to remind myself that I just cannot stress about the things that are out of my control, because it'll just take up too much of my time and energy. And it's been very hard to remind myself of that, but especially now, especially with the type of job that I have, where I work at a agency that is at the will of a ever-changing administration, to put it lightly. Things got a little bit better in November, but by then it may as well have been Thanksgiving and then, the December holidays and the New Year, which is right around the corner. So yeah, I don't know if I've just been in some kind of interesting mood lately because of everything that's been happening in the world, but I did pick a somewhat more somber topic for today's episode. I promise it's interesting, but it's definitely not the happiest topic in science I could have picked. You probably already saw the episode title if you're listening to me yap right now, but the bulk of today's episode will be about the dogs of Chernobyl. So these are mostly free-range dogs that live in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and I will be getting a lot more into why they are so interesting to scientists and to ecologists and cancer biologists in just a couple minutes. But the main reason I chose this topic from the very long list of papers and topics that interest me, I hope to one day talk about on here, because it somewhat relates to the work of one of my favorite scientists of all time, Jane Goodall, who unfortunately passed away at the beginning of October of this year, or 2025 if you are listening in the future. If you haven't been able to tell by the way I talk about how much I love learning and science and research, I was a PBS and National Geographic and Animal Planet kid. I've talked about this probably a few too many times, but I loved animals growing up. I really particularly wanted to be a marine biologist, like a lot of other kids. And my first job ever was actually working at the National Aquarium. Again, I've definitely mentioned this before. And I'm sure a lot of that comes from watching Jane Goodall documentaries and watching other TV shows that are more out in the field, working with all of the other wonderful animals that inhabit this beautiful planet. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about all of the wonderful impacts that Jane Goodall made on not only my view of science, but the entire scientific communities. I think, obviously, when you think of Jane Goodall's work, you think of everything that she did with primates and monkeys and apes. But one of the greater contributions I think that she really did make to science and the world is just how much we understand what it means to be human. Because prior to her work with great apes and other monkeys, we were told to look at other animals in the animal kingdom as relics and things that are in museums and zoos, and that's putting it really lightly. We did not have nearly as much compassion, at least in the scientific community, for dealing with animals. And some would argue that's still the case. I wouldn't. I think there's a lot more animal guidelines in place, especially across Europe. The US is a little bit still strict, but it's a little more relaxed than most European countries, at least from what I've studied at school. We, as in the scientific community, had a very specific, distinct view of how humans were separate from every other animal, and that animals did not have the same capabilities of communicating or socializing or having empathy like we were able to. So that, again, kind of leads me right into just how groundbreaking, I guess to use a very hype term, Dr. Goodall's work was. As scientists, we're constantly told to leave our bias at the door and to just observe, as we see things and just write down what we see. But that doesn't always happen because when we try to strip away our biases, we actually create new ones. And in this case, when it comes to thinking about animals, we would not humanize them. We would think about them as animals completely separate from us, like I just explained. And that's a really big flaw because animals are a lot like us. They do have the ability to socialize. And they also experience distress and grief. And again, those are all anthropomorphized emotions that we didn't usually associate with other beings besides ourselves. And another somewhat big problem that a lot of scientists and the scientific community has, and again, I'm not ragging on a group that I'm also a part of, but it's important to point out that a lot of the information and way that we study science comes from the same place or comes from the same few places. And generally speaking, in terms of like getting or doing an experiment, it's good to control a lot of things and make sure that you are replicating things to a T. But that does create some problems. And this is often a problem with science communication as well. Just to talk about this briefly, for a long time, scientists were told to not communicate the research to the general public, which I think is a massive disservice that we have done to the world. Because, first of all, a lot of science is funded by taxpayer dollars. So at minimum, people should be learning about where, their tax money is going if they choose to care about that. Science communication used to kind of just be more referred to as teaching and being only in academia. A lot of the most famous science communicators of the 20th century were professors and teachers. So I think a lot of people also only associate learning about science with very traditional academic settings, which is fair, but science is for everyone and science is everywhere in the world. And that's one of the reasons why I love talking about it so much, especially on this podcast. And that's one of the main reasons I actually created this podcast, is to talk about how science really is every decision that you make, everything that you interact with in the world, and just everything in it. Again, getting back to Jane Goodall's work, the scientific community did not anthropomorphize animals and give them human emotions like jealousy, anger, stress, because that is how we feel, and that's how we see the world. And it was considered speculative and sloppy to do that for animals because you cannot ask them if they are feeling that way, like we can ask another human person. But as we've learned a lot more about animal behavior and about their brains, thanks to Dr. Jane Goodall's work, we know that most mammals are a little bit more like us than we wanted to believe originally, especially when it comes to chimps and apes. Other animals do have the capacity to grieve and to feel anger and stress, and not just for the most basic of survival reasons. Everything I've talked about so far with Dr. Jane Goodall's work has been incredibly important, but I think the lesson that I learned from a very young age that has stuck with me even now as I actually do work in science is her ability to lead and conduct scientific research with compassion and curiosity. Two extraordinary qualities I think the world needs to be reminded of. So like I said, the rest of this episode is all about the Chernobyl dogs. In case you fell asleep during world history class, or haven't seen the HBO show in a while, the Chernobyl disaster occurred in 1986, when Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and a lot of Eastern and Central Europe. In the hours and days after the accident, people living nearby had no idea what had happened, and were forced to evacuate very quickly and very promptly, with not much of their belongings, including sometimes leaving behind pets. Many towns around Chernobyl were completely abandoned, and a large exclusion zone was created around the plant. Thousands of people suffered health problems, including increased rates of cancer, and many first responders also died due to extreme radiation. The power plant was located in the former Soviet Union and what is now modern-day Ukraine. The steam explosion and fires that burned for 10 days released enormous amounts of radioactive material, such as cesium-137 and iodine-131, and the radiation spread not only across Ukraine, but also Russia, Belarus, and much of Europe. But what happened after this catastrophe would have massive effects on the ecosystem around Chernobyl. One of the biggest unanswered questions after any disaster is what are the long-term environmental effects? Specifically, in the case of a nuclear disaster, how does long-term environmental contamination affect the genetics of organisms in the environment? Or in other words, how does this new hostile environment affect our genetics? A classic gene-environment interaction that we hope never happens. Here we are trying to develop our understanding and make some light out of the already disastrous situation. Some typical questions that scientists may ask specifically about the ecosystem in and around Chernobyl, include: does the high levels of radiation increase genetic diversity by driving up mutation rates? And if so, what kind of mutations are occurring? Additionally, are any populations able to become resistant to additional damages from radiation? As you may already be aware, highly mutagenic environments can introduce entirely new genetic variation. That being said, drop-offs in population numbers from numerous species due to high radiation exposure can also completely disrupt an ecological system. Though scientists have been back to Chernobyl numerous times to study how to prevent future possible nuclear disasters, like the one suffered in Chernobyl, as well as understand some of the damage done to the surrounding environment, we have not actually been able to study the effects of long-term radiation on larger-bodied animals, specifically also mammals within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. That is, until now. For a little bit of additional context, Russia, Ukraine, and a few other countries have a bit of a problem with stray dogs in a number of their cities. And basically what I mean by that is there's a lot of animals that are used to living around people but don't actually live with people at the moment. And it may sound like a cute thing to see a bunch of dogs roaming the streets, but this is actually a bit of an environmental and safety problem for a couple of reasons. For one, any animal that has a large population in an ecosystem that is not meant to be there generally is not good for other organisms in that ecosystem. And for number two, unfortunately, like any other animal, they can both contract and transmit diseases, both to other dogs and people. So it is a safety problem for people, it's also a safety problem for other dogs, and it's just generally not a great thing to have a lot of stray animals in a city, whether that be cats or dogs. Now, many of these dogs are actually incredibly smart and adaptable. Like I said, they are descendants of domestic dogs, so they're very trainable and pretty resourceful. And they are actually able to find food by usually getting it from people. And in the case of a small population of dogs in Moscow, they've actually managed to learn how to use the subway system in order to find food around the city, which is actually pretty impressive. However, getting back to Chernobyl, in Chernobyl, not only have the flora made a comeback, but some of the fauna as well. Particularly, again, these free-range dogs. Until recently, no population genetic study has ever examined a large domestic mammal living under continuous low-dose radiation exposure for decades. And yet, these free-range dogs have been living and forming families in and around Chernobyl since the accident itself. The big mystery isn't whether they survived, but who they actually are, where they came from, and what their genomes can tell us about surviving in a hostile, radioactive environment. The work I'm discussing today was conducted between teams of the National Institutes of Health, as well as a few other universities in concordance with the NIH, and the University of Kiev in Ukraine. The study focused on the population genetics of dogs living in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. The goal wasn't to look for dogs with mutant superpowers or dramatic radiation effects, but rather, researchers wanted to understand a more foundational question: what is the actual genetic structure of these populations? Understanding this then gives us a baseline to assess how the population genetics in this group has shifted over time. Because before you can study radiation-induced mutations, you have to understand the population itself first. There's long been speculation that these dogs are descendants of pets left behind during the evacuation. However, these animals that survived the initial radiation exposure also had to endure and avoid government culling efforts meant to prevent radioactive spread. Over time, cleanup workers and later tourists, and also scientists, began to feed them. And that human contact likely helped a lot of them survive, but that still doesn't answer our overarching question, and doesn't explain their genetic story. Were these dogs all part of one population? Were they part of multiple populations? Were they inbred? Were they mixing with other outside dogs? And most importantly, have they been genetically isolated long enough for radiation exposure to leave a detectable imprint? Researchers set out to characterize the genetic structure of 302 free-roaming dogs living along a radiation gradient, everywhere from inside the nuclear power plant itself to Chernobyl City to the comparatively less affected city of Slavituj, about 45 kilometers away. And apologies now, some of these cities with very Slavic names I have trouble pronouncing. This effort started back in the late 2010s and began in order to help get the dog population under control. This study represents the first genetic characterization of a large domestic species living in Chernobyl. And it establishes these dogs as a uniquely powerful system for studying the biological effects of long-term low-dose radiation on large mammals. Okay, so getting into how this study was actually conducted. Researchers began by collecting DNA from free-range dogs in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Over 3 years, scientists and veterinarians worked alongside spay, neuter, and vaccination clinics set up to control the growing dog population. Dogs were sampled along a cesium-137 contamination gradient, creating 3 main groups. Group 1 actually lived inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, as well as the Semikoti train station, which is the train station adjacent to the power plant, used for getting materials there. Group 2 lived in Chernobyl City, which is about 15 kilometers or 9 miles away. And Group 3 lived in Slavituch, a city roughly 45 kilometers or about 28 miles away. This is where contamination levels were also the lowest. Volunteers safely sedated the dogs using tranquilizer darts and collected blood samples from each of the 302 individuals. Of those, 132 came from inside the Chernobyl power plant. Another 150 were sampled from Chernobyl City, and the last 16 came from Slavituch. This sampling strategy that the researchers used allowed them to directly compare dog populations living under different radiation exposure levels, while still controlling for geography. So, what was actually revealed about this population genetic study? The first and most striking result was that these dogs form 3 genetically distinct populations. Dogs living inside each of the 3 areas, the power plant, Chernobyl City, and Slavituch, were genetically distinct not only from each other, but also from every other dog population in the world. In other words, they did not recently migrate there from other cities or regions, and they were not regularly mixing with outside dog populations. They are genetically unique. Now, despite the separation, there is still some movement. About 77% of the dogs sampled were directly related to at least one other dog in the dataset, which again makes sense because they all appear to be a part of the same founding population. Researchers identified 15 extended families involving over 160 related dogs, with family connections spanning all 3 sites that they sampled. And now this tells us 2 important things. First, that these dogs are moving more than expected, but not enough to erase population boundaries. And second, their social structure is unusual. Instead of intense territorial competition, related family groups often coexist in the same place, suggesting cooperation rather than constant conflict. Genetically, dogs living closest to the reactor showed lower heterozygosity, which just means that they showed less genetic diversity. A direct result from an environmental, or in this case man-made, disaster that created a bottleneck for the population. There were only a few remaining individuals that were then the founders of the new population. In contrast, dogs farther away showed more genetic mixing, especially from modern breeds. The breed ancestry of the dogs of Chernobyl also tell us another interesting story. Dogs inside the power plant and in Chernobyl City share strong ancestry with German Shepherds and Eastern European Shepherd breeds. This is consistent with dogs historically common in the region during the Soviet era, which is when the disaster occurred. But dogs in Slavituch showed a much more recent integration from modern breeds, such as Labradors, Boxers, and Yorkshire Terriers, reflecting their ongoing contact with outside populations. This allowed researchers to timestamp genetic history. Older Shepherd-related haplotypes likely existed in the population before and immediately after the disaster, meaning they've been exposed to radiation for decades. But the newer breeds are starting to crop up, mostly in lower exposure areas. This distinction is essential for future studies. So why did I just spend 15 minutes talking about dogs that live halfway across the world? Why should we care about the genetics of free-range dogs that are bouncing back in an area we once thought was destroyed by nuclear waste? Because this population represents a phenomenon that we usually can't study, which is how large mammals exposed to continuous low-dose radiation across generations can live and survive, and how we can learn about how their environment may or may not be affecting their genetic code. Without this current work, any genetic differences found in the future could be dismissed as inbreeding or population structure rather than actual effects from the radiation itself. So, now that this groundwork exists, researchers can take ancestral shepherd haplotypes or clusters of genes from highly exposed dogs living in the power plant and directly compare them to the same genomic regions of dogs living in surrounding cities, like Slavituch in Chernobyl City. This then makes it possible to identify radiation-associated mutational signatures, genomic scarring, and potentially even survival loci, or genes that allow large mammals to tolerate chronic harm from the environment. These dog populations represent a very unique opportunity in science. They are a semi-isolated, genetically distinct population with a complex family structure and a clearly defined family history. Studying them doesn't undo the tragedy of Chernobyl, but it does allow scientists to extract knowledge from it. Knowledge that can inform radiation safety, environmental disaster management, and long-term human health risk assessment. Ultimately, the dogs of Chernobyl may help answer one of biology's biggest and hardest questions: how life persists, adapts, and survives in places it was never meant to endure. That is all I have for this study at the moment. This was a natural experiment utilizing population genetics to better understand the dogs in the region around Chernobyl. Obviously, anything having to do with radiation is also very important for possible cancer research in the future, so I'm sure that is an outlook that these researchers are looking at for the future. And that is all I have for the science in today's episode. But I did once again want to finish off by sharing what I've been watching and reading, and unfortunately, I kind of have a long list of both because I included a list from the last time I recorded. And if you've been counting, it's been a few months. So I have gotten through a few films and books, and I will only be sharing what I watched in theaters because the list of things I've watched at home, both movie and TV show wise, is too long. So, yeah. I finally finished The Secret History by Donna Tartt back in the end of August. Wow, that was a very long time ago now. And I did not see the ending coming, so I'm glad I did finish that book. Not my favorite book of all time, but that's okay. Definitely a solid 3.5 stars. Would recommend with caution because it is very sad and it does have a very unreliable narrator, a term which I hate, but it is definitely evident from the back half of the book that Donna Tartt did intend for the narrator to be very unreliable. So, yeah. Then I also finished Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. This is a book I will not shut up about. I recommend it be on everyone's TBR list. It was very good. 5 stars, probably my favorite book of 2025. For those of you who don't know me that well, I love a thriller and mystery book, and so these next 3 do fit that description in some way. In November, I read Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. This is probably one of my favorite mystery books I've read in a while. This book is about a married couple that lives in London that takes a trip up to the Highlands in Scotland, and they basically stay at this chalet kind of cabin vibe, and a lot of very eerie things ensue. I don't want to spoil it though, because it does get a lot better after that. It's a little slow, and I usually do not like books that are told from 2 different perspectives. Each chapter alternates between the wife's perspective and the husband's perspective, and I usually do not like that kind of thing, but I think it's actually done really well here because the author is able to slowly give you information by splitting who's telling the story. This is definitely probably a 4-star mystery for me. Is it the best mystery ever? No, but it definitely had my jaw on the floor when there's 2 big plot twists that happen towards the end, and the first one I did not see coming. Second one was teed up well and made sense, but the first one did not see coming. If you're looking for a good mystery book, would recommend this one. A mystery book I would not recommend is The Perfect Marriage by Geneva Rose. Perfect is crossed out in the title, so I don't know if it's The Perfect Marriage or The Marriage, but this book is strikingly similar to the last one I just mentioned. I mistakenly read them back to back. Rock, Paper, Scissors is a much better version of this book, even though The Perfect Marriage came out a year before Rock, Paper, Scissors. The only reason why I even finished The Perfect Marriage is because the characters literally live in Kalorama Park in DC, which is down the street from where I live. Was there 2 days ago, literally, and they have a lake house in Prince William County and things like that. So there's a lot of things that were shouted out, or a lot of landmarks in the DC area were shouted out, basically. But it is a similar premise. It is husband and wife, and each chapter alternates from one of their perspectives. So the first chapter is the wife's perspective, and then the second chapter is the husband's perspective. But unfortunately, unlike the last one, for me, The resolution was not very satisfying. The mystery was not very intriguing. Neither character was that interesting. The premise is, and this all happens in chapter 1, basically the husband is cheating on the wife at their lake cabin and has been for years. And then the mistress of the husband ends up dead. She's brutally murdered and stabbed like 30 something times. And obviously, like, the rest of the book is the police trying to figure out who killed her. But obviously, like, the perspectives you get are, again, the wife and the husband. So you don't get the police perspective on it ever. I want to spoil it, but I won't. But if you want to read a good mystery book, don't read this one, because both of the narrators are terrible. They're not sympathetic people. The husband is written to be dumb and, quite frankly, a little bit pathetic and sad. And the wife is psychotic. Not in the clinical sense, but her actions can only be described as insane. I mean, based on that description, you can kind of assume what happens. The only reason why I was able to finish this book is because of how many shout outs there were to things that I have seen or been to. I personally do usually enjoy reading books and watching movies that take place in DC because I love seeing what they do and don't get right. And I especially appreciate when it isn't just a book or film about the government, because a lot of media that takes place in DC is about the government in some way, shape, or form. And you know what? Sometimes you get tired of reading about that. So yeah, this one was a solid 1.5 stars for me, unfortunately. Again, wouldn't really recommend it unless you want to read about characters floundering for like 12 chapters and a psychotic ex-wife. Finally, the last book I read somewhat recently was another mystery, and that was The Truth About the Devlins by Lisa Scottline, or Scottline. I'm not quite sure if I'm saying her last name properly. This, in terms of storytelling and writing, was probably my favorite mystery book of the 3 I read in the past couple of months. If you are looking for a mystery film with good character building and good character arcs, this is definitely the best of the 3. The story, like the mystery itself, wasn't as compelling. However, I literally did finish this book because I wanted to know like where it went with the characters, and I actually really liked all of the characters' arcs. I think it made sense. This book is about a family of lawyers, the Devlins, and they run a law practice called Devlin, 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 Devlin. Both parents and 2 of the 3 kids are lawyers. The 3rd kid is the black sheep of the family. He is the middle child, and he is not a lawyer. He is a recovering alcoholic and addict. And he still works for the law firm, but obviously not in the capacity as an advocate or lawyer. I personally thought that arc for the main character was very interesting and well done and handled well. So I think of these 3, this one, in terms of characters, is definitely my favorite, and I would give it 4 stars. Definitely would recommend. And finally, a brief recap of some of the films I've watched. I'm just going to quickly run through some of the ones I've seen in theaters. Ironic that I've seen so many movies in theaters at the end of 2025 when I literally complain about how far away the theaters are from my apartment, but it's fine. I saw Jurassic Park in theaters in August. It was fine. It had dinosaurs. Fantastic. It was entertaining enough. The next up in September, I went to one of Regal Cinema's like classic September film viewings, and I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick. I wish I was on drugs for this film because that film is nuts. I had never actually seen it, and I was happy I saw it in theaters, like on a bigger screen. But I forgot there's almost no dialogue in this movie, and that there is a lot of parts that have no music either, and like almost no sound engineering. So it's a lot of just quiet, and I saw this movie after work when I was exhausted on like a Thursday evening, and I almost fell asleep while watching it because there are some parts that are a little slower. But I really liked the second act of the movie. The last act of the movie is really trippy, but the second act is very interesting, and I love like 1960s space things, so this definitely fit that perfectly. This movie is visually stunning. Everyone says that. That's a very cold take. And you know what? You get to listen to Strauss's Blue Danube a bunch of times, so what more could you ask for? And obviously this movie is a classic, so yeah, I really wish I had watched it after taking a gummy though, because man, those visuals are nuts. Next up, I watched a very different film in theaters, but also a classic, and that is The Sound of Music, which is my favorite film of all time. I have never seen this movie in theaters, although I have seen it dozens and dozens of times, so it was nice to see it on the big screen, and it was such a joy to see Julie Andrews singing in the movie. Then after that, I watched the 25th anniversary showing of Spirited Away, which I thought I had seen before in its entirety. I know I've seen the beginning a couple times, but apparently I had not seen the ending. And I've seen other Studio Ghibli films, so I couldn't believe I hadn't finished that movie, but it was very cute. Apparently I had only ever seen up until when the parents turn into pigs, which literally happens in the first like 20-25 minutes of the movie. So I had not gotten very far in the movie ever. But it was very cute. I enjoyed the ending. And of course, it has a very iconic score by Joe Hisashi, who does, I believe, most of the music for Studio Ghibli films as well. Next up for Noir November, I actually watched Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, which I personally have been trying to watch all of Hitchcock's canon over the past couple of years. So this, I think, was my 11th Hitchcock film that I'd seen. And this one's probably now in my top 4, actually. It is supposedly Hitchcock's favorite film of his own. And I really enjoyed it. It's a serial killer-esque film. I really liked it. I liked a lot of the tension in it. It was definitely not quite like psycho intense, but like thrillery kind of intense. And I enjoyed it a lot. I would say it probably is my third or fourth favorite now, behind Rear Window, Vertigo, and Spellbound. And also in November, I watched another kind of thriller, more so mystery than thriller, which would be the third Knives Out film, Wake Up Dead Man. And this is the first Knives Out film I'd seen in theaters. I had not seen Knives Out, the original, in theaters, and I had not seen Glass Onion, that's the second one, in theaters either. I really enjoyed it. I think there were some strong things about it, and there were some not so strong things about it. I absolutely adore Josh O'Connor, and he did such a fantastic job in this movie, as did Daniel Craig, as always. And I also thought that Glenn Close was really good too. Josh Brolin was funny, but he was not in a lot of it because he dies pretty early in the movie. It's not a spoiler, it's literally in the trailer for the movie. But yeah, all in all, absolutely love Josh O'Connor in this film. Also, side note, Josh O'Connor I think has my favorite American accent of all time. Or sorry, Brit doing an American accent. My second favorite is probably Joseph Quinn, specifically in Stranger Things. But Josh O'Connor definitely takes the trophy on that one. I think he nailed it. A couple things that were strong for this movie for me was conceptually the idea of the mystery was decent. I love a lockbox mystery. My favorite Agatha Christie book is actually a lockbox mystery. It's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And I think this, like, in terms of story construction, was very good and, like, stuck to that structure pretty well. The lighting and the music for this film was very good as well. The music was giving Conclave, though. I mean, I know, obviously, the story was about religion and specifically Catholicism, but the score was a little bit too reminiscent of Conclave, personally, for me. My minor complaint about plot about this film was that, small spoiler alert, poison is one of the murder weapons in this film, and maybe it's just because I'm a scientist who specifically spent a lot of time studying pharm and neuropharm in college. I love when poison is used as a very good murder plot point. The poison in this film was pentobarbital, which is a barbiturate, which is usually used in small doses as an anesthetic or to treat insomnia briefly. However, it kind of just felt like that was the first poison that someone could think of that would slowly-ish kill you upon overdosing on it. It was not as clever as some other mystery novel murder weapon poison choices. Yeah, I could totally make a list of my favorite ones if anyone wants to hear that, but I'm sure no one does because that's a really niche thing to latch on to in a mystery film. But yeah, I just like it when the murder weapon very seamlessly fits into the plot. And again, this one just kind of felt like it was plucked out of a hat because like a doctor could seamlessly have it, maybe. Which is true. Like, it's a barbiturate, again, used as an anesthetic, so that makes sense. But I was kind of like, really? Like, you didn't come up with something a little bit more clever? Really? But yeah, maybe that's just me. Sorry. But overall, I still did enjoy the movie. Solid 4 stars. And if anyone wants to watch it, it is on Netflix. So, finally, the last movie I watched in theaters recently was Wicked for Good. And I will say, second act of Wicked is not as strong as the first act. And I did know that going to the movie, but man, this one was not as fun as Wicked. And that's a shame. I did still cry just because, like, the ending is sad. And also, just For Good is such a beautiful song that is literally when I started sobbing in the theater. But yeah, it was fine. I did not love how many flashbacks there were in this movie. I felt it was unnecessary. I thought the new songs did not need to be there, but the songs that were original to the musical were all pretty solid, at least in terms of like the performances given. But seeing the movie did make me want to go see actual Wicked, the musical, again. So maybe in the future I will get to go see it in New York. I've actually never seen a Broadway show in New York, so that is a New Year's resolution, if one can call it that, to maybe go see one this year for the first time ever. And on the TV show front, I was rewatching West Wing in October because watching a fictional competent government during a government shutdown was somehow making me less depressed. Yikes. And then I also finally finished The Pit, which was fantastic. Season 1 of The Pit was so good. It was so sad at the end, but it was fantastic, and I'm so excited for season 2. And that is all I have for today. If you're still listening, thank you so much for making it all the way through this episode of All My Nerves. And as always, I will have any of the articles, studies, and videos or any other media I may have referenced linked in the episode description. If you like this episode, definitely please consider leaving a review or following the podcast on Spotify or wherever you're listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to check out the podcast Instagram at All My Nerves Pod. Again, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for tuning in, and definitely check back soon for another episode of All My Nerves.